Not far from here, almost 57 years ago, Dr. Martin Luther King spoke movingly to remind America of the fierce urgency of now, because now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children. We hold this hearing today to remind America that today there are few things more fiercely urgent than the need to grant clemency to the thousands who suffer from the burdens of excessive and unjust imprisonment or the collateral consequences stemming from their criminal convictions. Perhaps not coincidentally, these burdens are disproportionately borne by people of color. The Constitution provides the President with broad authority to grant clemency because the framers understood that the criminal justice system needed a safety valve that would guard against excessive or unjust punishments. Article 2, Section 2 gives the President the power to, quote, grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment, unquote. Until fairly recently, most presidents were relatively generous in granting clemency. According to a statistical analysis by one of our witnesses, Professor Rachel Barkow, between 1892 and 1930, 27% of clemency applications resulted in some form of clemency. As recently as the 1970s, President Carter granted 21% of the petitions he received, President Ford granted 27%, and President Nixon, who was famously known as a law and order president, nonetheless, he granted 36% of clemency petitions. It was only in the beginning of the 1980s that clemency grants began to decline sharply. I have long been concerned with the stinginess with which modern presidents have granted clemency. And between 2013 and 2014, I wrote 4 different letters to my favorite president, President Obama, and then Attorney General Holder, urging the President to grant more clemency petitions. And I authored 2 opinion pieces on the subject. And I would ask unanimous consent to insert these letters and opinion pieces into the record. Without objection, so done. Thank you. With President Trump, I am afraid that we've received a new low when it comes to the clemency power in terms of the number of petitions he has granted, his seemingly self-interested motivations for his clemency decisions, his unwillingness to use a systematic, transparent, objective process for considering clemency petitions. In President Obama's situation, he was a little slower, or a lot slower than I thought he should be, and I exorcised him every time I saw him. Every opportunity I had with him, I told him, we need to get clemencies done and get it started. He was a very thorough president. He set up a board. They did issue, I think it was give or take 2,500 commutations or pardons toward the end. They were all done objectively through a process. I thought he should have done closer to 10,000 or more because there were so many people languishing. But he did some, and he got it started. With Trump, we've seen a change, though. There have been very few pardons issued, commutations issued, and most of them have been based on President Trump's whims, his noting who supported the commutation or pardon request, which shows that we're not done in an objective basis, but a subjective basis, not what the law decided on an objective look at your record and your sentence and your reformation, but on who wanted you to be pardoned. And that's not the way we're supposed to do it. Presidents have customarily relied upon the recommendations of the pardon attorney who's within the Department of Justice in making decisions about clemency. While that process is subject to legitimate criticism because justice is often not interested in granting clemencies that are involved with prosecutions that underlings in justice might have secured, they are still involved in the clemency process and have been. That process is the one we have, but President Trump, in contrast, has completely circumvented even that process the Department of Justice has in making clemency decisions, not asking them to look at cases and give him advice, but treating clemency like it is solely his personal gift to bestow upon individuals. Like the king, from which this power kind of came overseas and into our Constitution. And according to the New York Times, most of his clemency grants were the results of these inside connections. Sylvester Stallone for the posthumous clemency of Jack Johnson, Kardashian woman for the other famous pardon of Miss Alice Marie Johnson, and then a few of her friends or people that she met while incarcerated. And then there's been others similar with Milken and others, and Eddie DeBartolo. So those were inside connections were even boasted of or publicized by President Trump, and sometimes it was the promotion of Fox News, but not the Clemency office in the Department of Justice. So according to a review conducted by the Washington Post, all but 5 of the 24 people who've received clemency from Trump had a line into the White House or currency with his political base, meaning that that's not a blind process. Just last month, President Trump issued 7 pardons, 4 commutations, including a pardon for the 1980s, quote, junk bond king, Michael Milken, the very personification in culture and life of Wall Street greed and excess, who was convicted and served prison time for securities frauds and conspiracy. According to the New York Times, Mr. Milken's pardon was a result of lobbying by many individuals with close ties to President Trump, including his personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, who I think earlier might have been his personal prosecutor, and his largest donor, Sheldon Adelson. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, Jared Kushner, and Ivanka Trump also advocated for that pardon. The Milken pardon shines a harsh light on the fact that President Trump pardons are mainly for the rich, the famous, and the well-connected. And that was in spite of the fact that Mr. Milken, when he was convicted, was told not to make any deals. And then he got a $50 million fee for doing the deal between Time Warner and Comcast. That merger was it Comcast? I think it was. No, CNN. Time, whoever it was a Ted Turner deal. He got $50 million and wasn't supposed to do it. Even when President Trump grants clemency in a deserving case, he does so seemingly for the wrong reasons and through the wrong means. In June 2018, he commuted the sentence of a lady who was one of my constituents at the time, now an Arizonian, Alice Marie Johnson, a 63-year-old woman serving a life sentence for a nonviolent drug offense, but only after reality star, TV star Kim Kardashian lobbied on her behalf. While I strongly supported the commutation of Ms. Johnson, as I have other constituents of mine, President Trump appears to have considered the merits of her application only because she attracted the attention of a celebrity patron. Most of my constituents, or all of my other constituents, do not have that luck. Similarly, President Trump posthumously pardoned boxer Jack Johnson, whose case was brought by Sylvester Stallone. Justice is supposed to be blind. The thousands serving time for nonviolent drug offense did not have Kim Kardashian or Sylvester Stallone to plead their cases for clemency, but they are just as deserving of relief, or maybe more so. These nonviolent individuals should be released based on their records and not celebrity endorsements or arbitrary whims of the president. And I've written President Trump and suggested setting up the panel like President Obama had and grant the clemency. Even better than the program bill that I think Congressman Collins might have been a sponsor of, a prime sponsor, the Second Chance Act, which I proudly supported, even when Democrats were resistant, because it was a step in the right direction and a good thing to do. But second step is not as good as can cover as many people as clemency can. And so I urged President Trump to use clemency, but did not hear back from him. Clemency should be expanded to become a routine part of the criminal justice system, and decisions as when clemency should be granted must be made on objective, transparent, and systematic processes. This is right and just. This is the rule of law. President Trump has granted clemency in 24 cases, but there have been more than 7,700 petitions filed during his presidency thus far. So it's not hard to figure that's less than 1%, way less than 1%. 0.3%, by the way, and nowhere near the 36% of Richard Nixon. Our nation's prison population is larger than ever, and many remain in prison because of mandatory minimums and sentencing disparities that Congress repealed without making the repeal retroactive. In other words, many remain in prison based on public policy that Congress has avoided, leaving many unjustly in prison. And while my concern is for justice and for those without their families and wallowing in a prison system, everybody pays for this. The prison system is extremely expensive, and taxpayers are paying for this lack of action. We will hear from our witnesses proposals for reform of the clemency process and ways to address the need for clemency. 2013, I proposed the creation of a compassionate release review board that would review sentences of current prisoners and make clemency recommendations. I also introduced H.J. Res. 8, a constitutional amendment that would ensure that no president can abuse the clemency power to escape accountability for his or her own crimes. Hope we consider these and other ideas. I thank our witnesses for being here. I'm looking forward to a fulsome discussion on the subject, and I would now recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Johnson, for his opening statement.